Hey everybody, this is the chapter Karl Marx, 1857 to 1863, from Marx Without Myth, a chronological study of his life and work by Maximilien Rubel and Margaret, Manale. The chronology about the socio-historical context of Marx in this period. It will be a separate video. So here we go. Karl Marx, 1857 to 1863. First section, 1857. While continuing to act as a regular correspondent for the Daily Tribune, Marx resumed his work in economics after reading recent contributions in that field by his former antagonist Proudhon. Manuel des spéculateurs à la bourse, published in 1857, and Proudhon's disciple Alfred Dariman, de la réforme des banques, published in 1856. During the first part of the year, 1857, Marx read and took notes on Thomas Tooke's History of Prices, volumes 5 and 6, 1857. When in January and February the Tribune temporarily stopped publishing Marx's contributions, the family found itself in dismal financial straits. Virginia's inheritances had been consumed by the move from Soho Square to Maitland Park. Marx was obliged to accept Charles Donna's offer of guaranteed payment for one article per week, whether one be printed or not, with additional payment only for those articles actually used. Marx saw himself, quote, in a more desperate situation than 5 years ago, end quote. He wrote to Engels, quote, I thought I had already swallowed the quintessence of misery, mais non. And the worst of the matter is that this crisis is not temporary. I do not see how I am going to work my way out of it, end quote. Marx, January 20th, 1857. Among the topics of international significance which Marx treated for the Daily Tribune, the most persistent was British aggression in the East, Persia, China, and India. Marx also dealt frequently with financial questions and with political and social problems in England. The issue of the Lorca, quote, arrow, became a topic of parliamentary debate in England and resulted in the dissolution of Parliament, as the country's naval forces launched an offensive against Canton and other Chinese ports. Marx denounced, quote, this mode of invading a peaceful country without previous declaration of war, end quote, under the pretense of an insult to the British flag. But while the press was full of outcries against the Chinese wrongs, no word was said about the British crimes, opium trade, corrupting native civil servants, fraud, Chinese slave trade, and, quote, bullying, end quote. January 23rd, 1857. The outbreak of hostilities in India delayed the prosecution of the Second Opium War until the end of the year. Marx then interrupted his reporting on China until the second half of 1858. The Sepoy Rebellion was for Marx a symptom of the general discontent with the British hegemony in the Asiatic world. However infamous the conduct of the natives, it was only a, quote, reflection, end quote, in concentrated form of Britain's own conduct in India during the whole of its rule. In January, Marx began writing a pamphlet in reply to the pro-Russian articles published by Bruno Bauer in 1853 to 1854 and sent to Marx at the beginning of this year by Edgar Bauer. He studied material on Russian history and on the political views of Russia's Scandinavian neighbors and composed a table of events for the 10th to the 17th centuries in Russian history. The manuscript for this pamphlet was abandoned unfinished. Upon the request of its editor, David Urquhart, Marx provided the Free Press with the pertinent information on the treacherous role played by the spy Banya in Circassia and his relations with Constantinople. Articles based on this information appeared in the Free Press in April and May 1857. Charles Donna solicited Marx's collaboration in April on a new popular encyclopedia which he was planning to publish together with George Ripley. Engels advised Marx to accept the offer, thinking that this would be a, quote, enormous lift, end quote, for his friend, and suggested that he accept as many articles as possible. Marx agreed to write the articles on economics for the New American Encyclopedia, Engels those on military personages. Marx began with a one-page article on, quote, aesthetics, which he never finished. He did, however, compose a number of biographical entries, notably one on Simón Bolívar, about October 1857. When assembling material for these short biographical sketches, Marx employed various encyclopedias in different languages. The German lexica he characterized as, quote, written for children under 8, end quote. The French as, quote, partisan but at least mundane. The English encyclopedias candidly copy the French and the German, end quote. Letter to Engels, September 25th, 1857. The Marx family's financial situation did not improve, especially since they were frequently ill and required medical attention. In July, Jenny Marx was delivered of a child that died shortly after birth. In the spring, Marx suffered a recurrence of his liver ailments, which seriously impeded his work on the, quote, economics. Engels' aid came to at two crucial moments: in July 1857 to pay the overdue rent, and in December 1857 for the long overdue taxes. After 18 months of silence, Lassalle and Marx resumed their correspondence in April 1857. Lassalle reported on his recent voyages, his life in Dusseldorf, and the advancement of his, quote, half-philosophical, half-philological, end quote, work on Heraclitus, which he had now taken up again for the first time in 10 years. While finishing this theoretical work, Lassalle was also laboring on a more, quote, concrete political economic product, end quote, and promised Marx copies of both as a sign of his, quote, unchanged respect and friendship, end quote. April 26, 1857. Marx, meanwhile, was also making progress on his economics, his, quote, economics. In August, he drafted a general introduction which, for the first time, elaborated in great detail the plan and procedure he intended to follow in constructing his work. He explained that his method would be to proceed from the abstract to the concrete, since the abstract categories of our thought are the actual starting point of observation and conception, not, however, the source which generates the concrete. He distanced himself with this method from Hegel, who, quote, fell into the error of considering the real as the result of self-coordinating, self-absorbed, and spontaneously operating thought, while the method of thinking from the abstract to the concrete is but the way of thinking by which the concrete is grasped and reproduced in our minds as concrete, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. For Marx, therefore, the simplest abstract category exists only as the one side of a given concrete subject in its relation to man. His plan moved in accordance with this concept of method from the most highly abstract categories of political economy, applicable to all forms of society, to their concrete forms as found in existing society, and used the Hegelian scheme, elaborated in his logic, of following the, quote, generality, and the concept's, quote, particularity, and its, quote, singularity. The plan for Marx's book, 1, of the, quote, economics, was sketched out in the second of 7 notebooks, that contained what was later entitled the Grundrisse zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, outlines of a critique of political economy. Like the overall plan of the, quote, economics, it was divided into 6 parts. Part 1, Section 1, the general concept of capital. Part 1, Section 2, the particularity of capital, circulating capital, fixed capital. Capital is a means of subsistence, raw material, instrument of labor. Part 1, Section 1, capital is money. Part 2, Section 1, the quantity of capital, accumulation. Part 2, Section 2, capital as measure of itself, profit, interest, value of capital. Capital is differentiated from itself in interest and profit. Part 2, Section 3, the circulation of capital. Part 2, Section 3, subsection A, the exchange of capital for capital, exchange of capital for revenue, capital and prices. Part 2, Section 3, subsection B, the competition between capitals. Part 2, Section 3, subsection C, the concentration of capital. Part 3, capital is credit. Part 4, capital is share capital. Part 5, capital as the money market. Part 6, capital is source of wealth, the capitalist. After finishing with, quote, capital, end quote, Marx intended to embark on Part 2, an investigation of bourgeois society as a universal organization manifested in capital, wage labor, landed property, social classes, etc. Part 3 was to be devoted to an analysis of bourgeois society as a state apparatus, with its institutions such as taxation, public debts, credit, Part 4, to the international organization of production, and Part 5, to the world market. Of the abstract categories which Marx undertook to examine, the most fundamental, as far as political economy is concerned, is the concept of value. Value's most concrete expression, money, provided the theme for Marx's second chapter. In the introduction, he examined as well the concepts of labor and production, generalizing the common elements of the two at all levels of economic development. Yet he remarked that alone these concepts were nothing but abstractions which were never at any stage part of the productive process. Production always means a certain mode of production at a certain stage of social development and is inexorably bound to the social circumstances. To imagine that production might exist outside society, quote, is as great an absurdity as the idea of the development of language without individuals being together, end quote. Marx goes even further, stating that, quote, man is in the most literal sense of the word a zoon politikon, not only a social animal, but an animal which can develop as a separate individual only in society, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. Social, and therefore economic activity is traditionally divided into four departments: production, consumption, distribution, and exchange. Marx's approach to these departments can be distinguished from that of his predecessors insofar as Marx distinguishes for each the historical form, the universal qualities, i.e. those qualities which remain true under all social conditions, and those which are subject to change. Further, Marx pointed out the social nature of distribution as the twofold mediator between production and consumption. The means of production are distributed among the members of society and determine accordingly their share in the total social product. Secondly, the means of production are distributed as well among the various branches of economic activity. Marx's method of political economy therefore demands that, to understand the socio-historical nature of each economic department or category, the social interactions between these categories be constantly kept in mind. Productivity, a function of man's social relations and social power, has according to Marx three stages of development. At the first stage, it is a function of personal dependency between men, e.g. master to slave. On a higher level, personal dependency is replaced by material dependency. Finally, at the last stage, the means of production have become objects of communal control, permitting henceforth free individual activity and universal development of the individual capacities. The key to universal development for Marx is, quote, time. When society is organized so that production has become community production, time will continue to be an essential determining factor, but will, however, no longer be a measure of exchange value. Given the latter, quote, an objective mediation is required, end quote. That is, money as something distinct from the product. Given communal production, on the other hand, time is the measure of social usefulness. Quote, the less time society requires in order to produce wheat, cattle, etc., the more time it gains for other forms of production, material and intellectual. As with the single individual, the universality of its development, its enjoyment and its activity depend on its saving time, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. The general indifference as to the particular kind of labor performed in modern society implied for Marx that labor had reached a high level of technical development independent of the individual working man. Quote, the state of affairs has found its highest development in the most modern bourgeois societies, the United States, end quote, where individuals attach no great personal importance to the tasks they carry out, regarding them merely as means for creating wealth. Thus, a particular form of production, namely of bourgeois society, must be studied at its most highly developed level, where the greatest degree of abstraction and generality may be formulated, enabling one to understand the abstract categories and workings of production as common to all levels of production hitherto. Quote, the anatomy of the human being is the key to the anatomy of the ape, but the intimations of a higher animal in the lower ones can be understood only if the animal of the higher order is already known, end quote. Beginning, then, with an analysis of the concepts essential to an understanding of bourgeois society, Marx examined the phenomenon of capital, chief source of value in this, the most highly developed system of production, where capital is established, capital itself is objectified wealth, as a productive force, the individual's labor, which is his creative power, is consumed not in a process of self-enrichment, but in enriching capital. Production serves, therefore, neither the universal development of man nor of society, but the one-sided development of wealth. Marx later abandoned these introductory pages, which he felt went too far in revealing to the reader the conclusions yet to be proved, replacing them in 1859 with the preface to the Critique of Political Economy. He concluded the general introduction with a lengthy passage on the relations between the levels of production in a given society and its artistic achievements, remarking that the perfection of a work of art is not a function of the material development of the society in which it is created. However, this level of material development is responsible for the unique environment from which the artist draws his inspiration. For example, quote, Greek art could in no event originate in a society which excludes any mythical explanation of nature, any mythical attitude towards nature, or which requires of the artist an imagination free from mythology, end quote. Grundrisse. The, quote, charm and attraction of such a work of art for us today, Marx concluded, was in no way contradicted by the primitive order of the artist's society. Towards the end of the year, Marx reported, the year being 1857 again, Marx reported to Engels that he was working on a summary of his economic studies, quote, in order to have at least the outlines clear before the deluge, end quote, December 8th, 1857. And to get rid of what had become for him a veritable, quote, nightmare. On the 21st of December, Marx answered Lassalle's letter of April 26, mentioning that the present economic crisis had spurred him on to advance the state of his writings on the principles of economics, and that hours of journalistic writing and illness had limited both the time and energy available for this task. He thanked Lassalle for the latter's recent publication on Héraclite de Dunkle, a figure who had always inspired him with, quote, great tenderness, end quote, and who after Aristotle was his favorite among the ancient thinkers. Marx's last journalistic contributions of the year contained much information on the uprising. Marx's last journalistic contributions of this year contained much information on the uprising in India among the sepoys and on the financial crisis which presently beset England and the continent. He was especially concerned with the effects of the crisis in France, where the state was intimately associated with the security markets. He saw little chance that the Bonaparte regime would survive the coming year. New section, 1858. Quote, accompanied by lemonade on the one hand and an immense amount of tobacco on the other, end quote, Marx continued working on his economic principles at night until illness and fatigue forced him to break off his writing in April. His investigations on capital involved much arithmetical calculation, always anathema for Marx, and he began therefore to study algebra in hopes of overcoming the difficulties. Letters to Engels, January 11th and 16th, 1858. By mere chance, he had come upon Hegel's logic. In 1857, and was inspired to use Hegel's method in treating political economy. He informed Engels of his, quote, discovery, saying, quote, if there is ever time for such work again, I should like to write 2 or 3 printer sheets which would enable the ordinary mind to understand the rational elements in the method discovered, yet at the same time mystified by Hegel, end quote. Marx, January 16th, 1858. As with so many of his plans, however, Marx never realized this intention. 1 second, I gotta get some water. Marx reported regularly to Engels on the progress he was making in elaborating his theoretical viewpoints and mentioned on January 16, 1858, having, quote, jettisoned completely the whole theory of profit as it has existed up till now, end quote. He discovered that the source of profit was, quote, free labor, end quote, performed by the working man who sold his labor power in exchange for the means of subsistence and reproduction. In the voluminous notes Marx made during this period, references often simply to, quote, labor. As he progressed in his writing, however, he began to differentiate, quote, labor, that which is realized in the production process, from, quote, labor capacity, end quote, Arbeitsvermögen, or Arbeitsfähigkeit, being what the worker exchanges for wages. The exchange value of the individual worker's labor capacity is determined, like every other commodity, by the actual labor time necessary to produce or reproduce it, i.e., by the amount of time which went into the production of all the things necessary to assure the worker's existence. The owner of the means of production, however, acquires the use of the worker's labor capacity for a certain fixed working day in which exceeds in hours the actual time required to pay for the worker's maintenance and reproduction. Therefore, quote, wage labor is always composed of paid and unpaid labor, end quote. Grundrisse. The labor which the working man furnishes is thus a certain exchange value, represented by the wages he receives, which does not correspond to its use value. Moreover, for the worker himself, labor has only exchange value and not use value, and therefore, quote, does not exist for him as the productive force of wealth, as the means or activity of enrichment, end quote. Grundrisse. Only for capital does the worker's labor have use value, becoming activity which increases wealth. The result of capital's exploitation of labor is, quote, profit, end quote, which Marx classes under the general heading of, quote, surplus value, end quote, Mehrwert. Because of his unique relation between labor's exchange value and its use value, the rate of profit of the owner of the means of production varies in direct proportion to the amount of living labor involved in the production of a given commodity. Since capital tends to encourage the replacement of men by machines, production costs fall, more objects may be manufactured, and the capitalist thus receives a greater quantity of profit, i.e. greater absolute profit. However, since according to Marx, profit is created as surplus value only through human labor, the act of reducing human participation in production actually reduces the relative profit rate, and this then ultimately leads to economic crises. At this stage, it may then be said that living labor power or labor capacity is no longer the principal source of wealth. Labor time has ceased to be the measure of value, and, quote, the surplus labor of the masses has ceased to be a condition for the development of wealth in general, end quote. Grundrisse. The measure of wealth is now, quote, disposable time, end quote, for society as a whole and each individual to develop freely, realizing his own capacities. Quote, with that, the production based on exchange value collapses, ... Individuals are then in a position to develop freely. Necessary labor time is not reduced in order to create surplus labor, but the necessary labor of society in general is reduced to a minimum. Correspondingly, the individual members of society have at their disposal the time and the means to pursue their artistic, scientific, etc. development, end quote. Marx. Grundrisse. Marx made several references to the plan of his, quote, economics, and corresponding with both Engels and Lassalle. On February 22, 1858, Marx revealed to Lassalle the plan worked out in his notebooks on the chapter on, quote, capital. Quote, the whole thing is divided into 6 books. 1. Capital, contains introductory chapters. 2. Landed property. 3. Wage labor. 4. The state. 5. International trade. 6. The world market. The work has to be, end quote. The work has to be, quote, a critical presentation of the system of bourgeois economy, end quote, i.e. his descriptive analysis of the present system was to be based on a critical orientation to this system. Marx mentioned his interest in writing 2 additional works, a critique and history of political economy and socialism, along with a historical sketch of economic categories and relations. But for the moment, Marx lacked, quote, the time, the quiet, and the means, end quote, to elaborate this first work and condense it to the first form which he would like to achieve before returning it over to a publisher. Lassalle proved useful to Marx in finding a publisher for the forthcoming work, one which would be willing to print it in a series of consecutive booklets. Marx wrote Lassalle that he would even be willing to renounce payment on the first booklet if only a publisher would accept his work. See letter of March 11, 1858. The publisher of Lassalle's own book on Heraclitus declared himself willing to accept Marx's venture and even to pay him a substantial fee. The first pamphlet or book was intended as a theoretical foundation for the whole, quote, economics, and would encompass value, money, and capital in general. The first 3 booklets together would cover the economic principles, the last 3 the basic trends of his critique of bourgeois society. He estimated that all 6 booklets would be up to 30 to 40 printer sheets, 500 to 600 pages, and that he could have the first installment down by the end. He could have the first installment ready by the end of May 1858, to Lassalle, March 11, 1858. Shortly thereafter, Marx described in detail the breakdown of the first of the 6 parts which he referred to as, quote, books. Book 1 was to consist of 4 sections. 1. Capital in general. 2. Competition. 3. Credit. 4. Share capital, quote, as the most perfect form, providing the transition to communism, end quote. April 2nd, 1858. The first pamphlet was to treat Section 1 alone. He began to explain to Engels the transition from capital to landed property, from landed property to wage labor, which is the final universal product of modern property relations. Marx's account of the contents of this first pamphlet was abruptly interrupted as a sudden attack of hepatitis put an end to his writing. His health worsened in the course of April 1858, and Jenny Marx assumed her husband's correspondence. Writing to LaSalle, she revealed the psychological aspect of the illness. Quote, mental unrest and turbulence due to his inability to complete his work quickly and without interruptions naturally worsen his physical condition. The same applies to the onerous tasks necessary to earn his, quote, daily bread, end quote, and they, of course, cannot be pushed aside, end quote. April 9th. Jenny Marx, April 9th to LaSalle, 1858. Marx came to Marx's aid in May 1858, giving Marx the opportunity to come to Manchester, where he could ride on horseback, engage in various sports, and recover from the weeks of illness and pressures of family life under such adverse conditions. As he remarked in an earlier letter to his friend, quote, there is no greater folly whatsoever for people with aspirations of universal dimensions than to marry and thus betray themselves to the petite misère de la vie domestique et privée. End quote. February 22nd, 1858. I don't know who that is. I don't know if that's Marx or if that's Engels speaking. It's from February 22nd, 1858. Upon his return from Manchester, the task foremost in his mind was to prepare the first installment of the, quote, economics out of the hundreds of pages he had written in the preceding 10 months. Quote, the hell of it is, end quote, he wrote to Engels, quote, that in this manuscript, with which, if printed, would make a thick volume, everything is topsy-turvy, and it contains much that is intended for later sections, end quote. Letter of May 31st, 1858. But once again, illness in the family and financial worries kept Marx from taking up the manuscript again until August. Relentlessly pursued by his creditors, he finally saw no alternative but to make a clean breast of his affairs to Engels and ask his advice on finding a loan. He sent his friend a detailed list of receipts and expenditures. From the £24 recently paid him by the Daily Tribune, for instance, Marx immediately settled the following outstanding debts and was consequently left with nothing for current expenses. £8. School for the quarter, February, March, April. Amount paid to Schapper for 4 weeks' daily expenses. School for quarter, February, March, April. £8. Amount paid to Schapper for 4 weeks' daily expenses. £3. Linen redeemed from pawnbrokers. £2. Wages for household aid, etc. Wages. Bracket for household aid, editors, end bracket. So that's that bracket's from Rubel and Manale. Tallyman, £1. Butcher, £2. Grocer, £2. Greengrocer, £1. Blouses and dresses, etc. for the children, £2. Baker, £2. His income scarcely sufficed to pay for their lodging, the children's schooling, and enough interest on their debts to keep the bailiff from the door. At which end he confided to Engels, quote, I wouldn't wish it to my worst enemy to have to wade through the quagmire in which I have found myself for the past 8 weeks, caught at the same time in the greatest fury, because my intellect is being ruined and my capacity to work broken down, end quote. July 15th, 1858, Marx. In vain, Marx tried to persuade his mother to pay out his part of the paternal inheritance. Finally, aid came from Freiligrath, who procured him a loan of £40 at 20% interest. Jenny Marx, whose nervous condition made the doctor fear cerebral meningitis, could then be sent off to the seaside for treatment. In August, Marx did some reading for the, quote, economics on currency, but put off his own writing until September 1858. However, once back into the subject, he expected to progress rapidly. On September 21st, 1858, he wrote to Engels that he would have the first 2 installments for Dunker ready within a fortnight. While elaborating the final draft, Marx noticed that he had been intended for a single booklet, that what had been intended for a single booklet now took up 2. He had expanded the section on capital in general, hoping to make it more comprehensible for the ordinary reader. When LaSalle wrote to inquire about what had happened to the promised manuscript, Marx replied that illness, his journalistic writing, and finally difficulties with the form of the, quote, economics had prevented him from finishing sooner. Quote, "I could smell my liver trouble in the style of everything I wrote," end quote, he told LaSalle. The result of 15 years of research, this project was to present for the first time, quote, "in a scientific manner an important view of social relations," end quote, and therefore Marx did not want it to be spoiled by a sick liver. November 12, 1858. With Jenny's aid, he copied out the first manuscript for publication between November and January 1859. Instead of the planned 5 to 6 printer sheets for the first section made up 12 sheets in all and contained only the first 2 chapters on commodities and money. The third chapter, the core of the theory on capital, was deferred till later. Not until 1867, however, did this, quote, chapter appear as Volume 1 of Capital. While Marx was engaged in his, quote, economics and with journalism, Engels was busy writing articles for the New American Encyclopedia, chiefly on military subjects. He sent Marx to the British Museum Library to gather information on, quote, catapult, quote, castrum, quote, camp, etc. In July 1858, Engels asked for Hegel's Naturphilosophie, which he wished to study in connection with his investigations in comparative anatomy and physiology. In Hegel, Engels saw an anticipation of modern science, quote, "Everything is cell. The cell is the Hegelian, quote, being in itself," end quote, and passes through the Hegelian process as it develops, until at the end the idea, the particular completed organism, results, end quote. Engels, July 14, 1858. In the 60-odd articles he wrote for the Daily Tribune, Marx dealt principally with British affairs at home and abroad, foreign trade, government finances, the fall of the East India Company, the repeal of the 1844 Bank Act. He also devoted numerous articles to the wars in China and India and was particularly critical of British methods of assuring hegemony in the East and of the opium trade. He summarized British foreign policy as, quote, "compulsory opium cultivation in India and armed opium propaganda in China," end quote. September 25, 1858. While defending free trade and opium for themselves, the, quote, Christianity-canting and civilization-mongering British government, end quote, used all possible tricks to maintain its own monopoly on production. He was especially caustic in attacking the morality of opium trade, which was based on the worst egoism and the brutalist methods of compulsion against the semi-barbarians who resisted the encroachment of British merchants. In the Opium War, quote, "the representatives of the antiquated world appear prompted by ethical motives, while the representatives of overwhelming modern society fights for the privilege of buying in the cheapest and selling in the dearest markets," end quote. Marx, September 25, 1858. Marx repeatedly mentioned the brutality of British methods used to suppress insurgency and the hypocrisy and deceit of the colonial agents and officials bent on personal enrichment. In Marx's estimation, the British army was the most brutal in the Western world, despite the fact that the country was, as a whole, frequently indulged in self-praise for its high moral standards. October 5, 1858. At home in England, evils were rampant in the poorhouses, which were often used for the mentally ill. Examining statistics on mental illness and poverty, Marx found a direct relationship between the proportion of mentally ill and indigent and the level of British exports and wealth. The misery in these institutions was so great that Marx wrote, "Horse stalls in the country would seem like boudoirs in comparison to the mental wards in the poorhouses, and that horses undoubtedly received better treatment than these British citizens." August 20th, 1858. Marx was equally critical of the politics of Napoleon III, who was at the time in a precarious financial situation because of the involvement of the French government in stock market speculation. He branded Napoleon as, quote, "the patron of slavery in all its forms," end quote, responsible for keeping the slave trade alive among the British. The slave issue, Marx noted, was soon to be the, quote, battle cry between imperialist and Republican camps, end quote. July 2nd, 1858. In Russia, the serfs had already been emancipated and Marx devoted an article to this topic in the Daily Tribune on October 19th, 1858. In his earlier correspondence with Engels, Marx had noted that the peasant emancipation in Russia marked the beginning of an internal crisis which might thwart the country's traditional foreign policy. April 29th, 1858. News of the convocation of, quote, notables, i.e. the aristocracy and the clergy, at St. Petersburg to discuss the matter of emancipation for the enslaved classes was for Marx a consoling sign that, quote, the revolution, end quote, had at last begun in Russia. Letter to Engels, October 8th, 1858. With the publication of his work on, quote, economics, Marx wrote Lassalle, he hoped that, quote, a number of better heads, end quote, would be induced to take up the study of political economy as well. November 12th, 1858. New section, 1859. By January 20th, Marx had finished the manuscript for the first booklet of the, quote, economics, but lacked even the funds to pay for its postage from London to Paris. Quote, iron necessity, end quote, forced him to ask Engels for help again, and he wrote, quote, I don't think that anyone has ever written about, quote, money under such conditions of financial destitution. Most of the authors on the subject were in utmost harmony with the topic of their research, end quote. January 21st, 1859. Not until February 9th did Marx, sick with worry, receive notification of the receipt of his manuscript. The story of the, quote, economics continued to be marked with delays, and the first installment did not appear until mid-June. While awaiting its appearance, Marx solicited Weidemeyer's aid in arousing interest in America for the forthcoming publication, which he claimed, quote, destroyed at its basis the Proudhonian socialism now fashionable in France, end quote, and would help their party to a scientific victory. February 1st, 1859. Marx also inquired of Charles Dana about the possibility of finding a publisher for an English translation of the, quote, economics. Dana's reply, March 15th, was negative. Marx continued reporting regularly for the Daily Tribune, which published about 40 articles from him during this year. The central themes of his reports were the Italian War of Independence from Austria, British aggression in India, and economic and political affairs in England itself. One of the first articles to appear in this year was the third in a series which analyzed the emancipation of the Russian serfs, an event which Marx predicted would, quote, find a great echo in the world and be of great significance for the papal liberalism of 1846. Will be of greater significance than the papal liberalism of 1846, end quote. Although aristocratic classes would doubtless oppose the Tsar's ukaz, it was equally certain that the people would resist any further oppression. The reign of the Russian people, those, quote, semi-Asiatic serfs, end quote, would be, when it came, a reign of terror, something unheard of in all previous history, and would mark the beginning of true civilization in Russia. January 17th, 1859. For all the European nations, the question of Italian unity was of key importance, for as Marx remarked in an article on January 24th, 1859, a war which broke out in any one place in Europe would not end there. Following closely the role played by Napoleon in this affair, Marx was convinced that the French ruler wanted intimidation and not real war, hoping that a diplomatic victory over Austria would replenish the empty state treasuries. In the peace, the war prospect in Europe, Marx predicted that the loss of a single battle in Lombardy might mean the fall of the Napoleonic Empire. January 31st, 1859. Marx continued to criticize sharply Britain's colonial policies. Reporting on an incident concerning the Ionian Islands, he exposed the system of oppression whereby the colonialists pretended to assume responsibility over foreign territories in order to educate them in the principle of liberty. The facts showed that, quote, to be free at home, John Bull must enslave abroad, end quote. January 6, 1859. Marx also dealt with the ruses and tricks which the British factory owners used in order to avoid compliance with the laws on the employment of children and young people. March 24, 1859. He also commented on a reform bill which was up before Parliament and which in his opinion would only strengthen class monopolies. A certain number of Marx's reports to the Daily Tribune were ostensibly sent from a correspondent in Berlin in order to give them greater plausibility. To add, quote, local color, end quote, he also requested information from Lassalle, who was living in Germany. See letter to Lassalle, March 28, 1859. In June, he predicted that the approaching foreign hostilities, coupled with the jealous rivalry of the German princes and social misery, would lead to a great internal and external upheaval which would profoundly shake the German states. June 10, 1859. The year's voluminous correspondence with Lassalle contains, apart from the interesting notes on Prussian affairs, a lengthy exchange on the Italian War of Independence. When questioned by Lassalle as to the seriousness of the impending war, Marx remarked that Victor Emmanuel of Italy and Bonaparte were most definitely ready to collaborate against Austria, and gave 4 reasons why Napoleon would be induced to support the Italian nationalists. 1. He feared the, quote, Italian daggers, end quote, in revenge for the execution of Orsini. 2. French finances were in a disastrous state and the army could no longer be maintained at home. 3. He hoped to restore his prestige. And 4. He was the tool of the Russians, who desired war against Austria to break the latter's hold over the Slav peoples. See letter to Lassalle, February 4th, 1859. See also New York Daily Tribune, February 1st, 1859. Marx disagreed with Lassalle's view that a Hungarian insurgency would break out once Austria and Italy were at war. Kossuth, he remarked, had degenerated to a traveling lecturer, a colporteur of the same drivel everywhere in England and Scotland. While the war would have an immediate counter-revolutionary effect, Marx thought that the ultimate result would be revolution in Europe. On the practical side, Lassalle offered Marx work as a correspondent for his cousin's newspaper, the Vienna Presse. The matter was frustrated by the outbreak of war, as Marx's letters to the Presse remained unanswered. In the shadow of the approaching conflict, Engels completed writing a pamphlet, Po und Rhein, which Lassalle arranged to have published by Duncker in April. This pamphlet, which in the first printing did not carry Engels' name, was widely acclaimed both by the general public and in military circles. The object of its critique was the traditional military strategy of, quote, natural frontiers, end quote, according to which France declared the Rhine indispensable for the protection of its northern frontier, while the Germans held the Po and the Mincio to be the natural lines of protection for their southern frontier. Engels argued that neither France nor Germany needed such, quote, natural lines of defense for internal security, and that such conflicts among neighbors over boundary lines only aided Russia in expanding her own frontiers to the west. Germany's efforts should be concentrated around the problem of national unity. Quote, once we have this unity, the defensive operations can stop, end quote. The future map of Europe would certainly continue to undergo changes, tending in general toward the true natural frontiers of each of the, quote, great and viable, end quote, European nations, as determined according to language and congeniality, while the, quote, splinter nations, end quote, incapable of unity would be incorporated into the larger ones. The publication of this pamphlet and of one by Lassalle on the same topic entitled Der Italienische Krieg und die Aufgabe Preußens, published in May 1859, delayed the appearance of Marx's Economics until early June. Meanwhile, Lassalle sent Marx copies of his Franz von Sickingen, a drama about the tragic end of the knightly revolutionary Sickingen and of the pamphlet on the Italian War. Marx found fault with Lassalle's portrayal of the peasant movements and the revolutionary elements in the cities, which Marx held should have provided the protagonist Sickingen with a meaningful, vivid background. Quote, "Haven't you," end quote, he asked Lassalle, quote, "fallen into the same diplomatic error as your Franz von Sickingen by ranking the Lutheran knightly opposition above the plebeian Munsurian," end quote. It's a reference to Thomas Munzer, the radical, like the leader of the radical Reformation in Germany. Marx most vigorously opposed Lassalle's views as presented in The War in Italy, where he defended the cause of Italian unity with Prussian support against the Austrians. He held that this pamphlet entirely failed to recognize the Russian hand pushing Napoleon into supporting the patriotic cause of Italy. Lassalle defended a cause which would lead only to disorganization among the German armies and benefit the Tsar and Napoleon. It also generated Marx's criticism that Lassalle had presumed to speak in the name of the, quote, party on this issue, for he felt that party discipline should be maintained in critical times, if the cause was not to be lost. He proposed, therefore, to Engels that they compose a party manifesto in order to dispel some of the confusion among the diverse revolutionary groups. May 8, 1859. Apropos the impending war, Marx read in May a study by Karl Vogt on the present situation in Europe and became convinced of the author's strong Bonapartist leanings. At this time, he also attended as a representative of the Daily Tribune a public meeting on the Italian War organized by David Urquhart. Approached by Karl Blind, Marx was informed that Karl Vogt received subsidies from the French government in order to carry out pro-Bonapartist propaganda and that Blind was in possession of material proof that Vogt had betrayed his country. May 9, 1859. Meanwhile, Marx met with members of the German Working Men's Association in London to discuss participation on the German-language newspaper Die Neue Zeit, an ineffective organ presently under the editorship of Edgar Bauer. The group decided not to collaborate on any paper which they did not edit themselves and would therefore support the rival organ Das Volk, which the association as a whole planned to found in opposition to the Bauer publication. At this meeting, Marx declared that Engels and he were self-appointed representatives of the proletarian party and that their appointment was, quote, countersigned by the hatred unqualified and universal which all old world factions and parties devote to us, end quote. Letter to Engels, May 18th, 1859. In the second issue of Das Volk on May 14th, 1859, an article appeared which revealed the true nature of Karl Vogt's activities and was written without Marx's consultation by Ellard Biskamp. Vogt, who attributed the article to Marx, wrote an open letter to the Swiss Handelscourier, June 2nd, in which he characterized Marx as the head of a, quote, band of hooligans, end quote, intriguers and extortioners, and warned the working class to beware of this unscrupulous agitator. Even before the first booklet of the, quote, economics appeared by Duncker in Berlin, the journal Das Volk published a large part of the preface, which contained interesting biographical notes on Marx's activities and studies prior to his research in political economy. It began with an exposition of the complete plan for the, quote, economics in 6 parts or 2 triads constructed according to the methodological principles set down in the 1857 introduction and the Grundrisse themselves, whereby the influence of Hegel's logic had been decisive. Apart from the plan, the preface summarized briefly the theoretical views which he had developed in Paris and Brussels, departing from the standpoint of the, quote, anatomy of bourgeois society is to be sought in political economy, end quote. These views are 4. 1. The social, political, and intellectual life process depends in general on the production mode of material life. Quote, it is not men's consciousness which determines their existence, but the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness, end quote. 2. The productive forces of a given society develop to the point where they come into conflict with the property relations which had hitherto served as the necessary form of their development. 3. This conflict leads to social revolution and changes the basis of production. No social form ever disappears, however, before having developed the productive forces to the maximum possible under the given conditions, nor before the material conditions for the existence of new and higher production relations have been created within the framework of the old society. 4. Roughly speaking, there have been 4 areas in the economic development of society consisting of the Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production. Quote, the bourgeois production relations are the last antagonistic form of the social production process, ... With this social form, the prehistory of human society comes to a close, end quote. Marx's, quote, Economics appeared in its first installment under the title Sur Critique der politischen Ökonomie, bracket, Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, end quote, end bracket. It is divided into 2 chapters, on commodities and on money, similar to the first section of Capital, but unlike Capital, each of the 2 theoretical expositions is appended with historical material. By the time Marx was to finish the book on Capital, he had accumulated so much historical material that it could not be included with the theoretical sections, and he was obliged to leave it as aside for later publications. The only serious critique of Marx's long-awaited publication was written by Engels and appeared in Das Volk on August 4th and 20th. However, Engels treated only the preface before financial difficulties rendered further publication of the journal impossible. In the first article, Engels retraced the history of economic thought in Germany, mentioning the theories Marx had developed in earlier works and outlined in the preface. In Engels' words, the, quote, materialist interpretation of history, end quote, was a, quote, revolutionary discovery, end quote, which provided the theoretical basis for their party. In the second critique, Engels speaks of Marx as the first thinker since Hegel to, quote, develop a science according to its own proper inner coherence, end quote. Moreover, Marx had applied to history the, quote, core of the Hegelian logic, end quote, or in other words, quote, the dialectical method stripped of its ideological wrappings, end quote. Engels considered the elaboration of the dialectic method to be Marx's second great achievement and no less important than the materialist conception of history. History, Engels recounted, is the history of economic development, and the progress of ideas is the, quote, reflection in abstract and consistently theoretical form of the course of history, end quote. Engels' glorifying interpretation of Marx ends with a simplified outline of Sur Critique, reserving discussion for a later article which was never written. In Das Volk from July 23rd to the last issue of August 20th, Marx published documents of Russian diplomacy dated 1837, which gave proof of the Tsar's expansionist plans. The same document appeared in excerpt in the Daily Tribune on August 8, 1859, under the heading, quote, The Foreign Policy of Russia, Memoir on Russia for the Instruction of the Present Emperor, ... end quote. Before being discontinued, Das Volk also printed an unfinished series of 4 articles by Marx entitled, quote, Quid pro quo, end quote, a critical analysis of Prussian politics during the Italian War. Prussia's neutrality lent tacit support to Bonaparte's foreign policy, which consisted in the conduct of wars abroad in order to divert attention from his country's internal troubles. In his Tribune articles, Marx also remarked that, quote, war was the sole condition which kept Bonaparte on the throne, yet the wars which he fought were always senseless, vain, incited under false pretenses, squandering money and blood, and bringing no advantage for the French people, end quote. August 12, 1859. Marx feared that following the Treaty of Villafranca, which ended hostilities in Lombardy, a Napoleonic governorship would be instituted over Italy, August 4th, 1859, but he did not exclude the possibility of an Italian revolution which would return Mazzini and the Republicans to the forefront of a new national movement. In the last few months of the year, Marx treated British trade, electoral corruption, and, quote, population, crime, and pauperism, end quote, September 16, 1859, remarking that something must be amiss in a social system where wealth increases without reducing poverty and crime rates rise more rapidly than the population. They also found a disproportion in the trade relations with China. The opium trade continually expanded, but in inverse relation to the importation of Western manufactures. The only market the British could conquer in China was the drug market, for the traditions and habits of the population were so deeply ingrained as to make them inaccessible to Western civilization. December 3, 1859. Marx maintained that in general British aggression in China aided Russia and was the work of Palmerston, who continued to play deliberately into the hands of the Tsar while ostensibly defending a foreign policy which would thwart Russia's designs on Asia. October 1st, 1859. Information provided by Bartholomeus Zemera. September 1859. Served Marx as the basis for an article on, quote, Kossuth and Louis Napoleon, end quote. New York Daily Tribune, September 24th, 1859. Double-faced and deceitful, Kossuth was lacking in constancy and steadfastness and was capable of passing himself off at the same time as both a martyr and a courtier of Louis Napoleon, as a tool in the hands of a cruel oppressor and the representative of a subject nation. Marx resumed work on the, quote, economics in October 1859 after receiving an inquiry from LaSalle about the now overdue manuscript for the second booklet. He read and made excerpts from works on political economy, money, and fiscal problems by the British economists Richard Jones, Samuel Bailey, Jacob Vanderlint, T.R. Malthus, and Thomas Hopkins, but was soon interrupted by financial problems, the articles for the Daily Tribune, and the developing affair with Karl Vogt. In June 1859, the London German language paper Das Volk, along with the Augsburg Allgemeine Zeitung, republished the text of an anonymous fly sheet, zur Warnung, bracket, a warning, end bracket, dealing with the activities of Vogt as a secret paid agent of Napoleon III. Although the information stemmed from Karl Blind, the latter disclaimed the authorship of this fly sheet, publishing a declaration to that effect in the Allgemeine Zeitung in November 1859. Ferdinand Freiligrath, who along with Marx had been informed by Blind about Vogt's activities at the May 8th Urquhart gathering, refused to aid Marx in establishing Blind's authorship and published in the Allgemeine Zeitung a statement of neutrality, November 15, 1859. In the same journal shortly thereafter, Marx reaffirmed the fact that Blind had been the source of the information on Vogt, November 21, 1859. In December 1859, Vogt then brought out a lampoon entitled Mein Prozess gegen die, quote, Allgemeine Zeitung, end quote. My case against the Allgemeine Zeitung. Directly attacked Marx, who did not learn of the pamphlet's existence until 1860. Vogt interspersed a stenographic account of his proceedings against the Augsburg Journal, which, with falsified documents and allegations depicting Marx as the head of a gang of terrorists called the Schwefelbande. The Schwefelbande. Can't pronounce that. This attack Marx saw as an attempt to destroy the honor of the proletarian party, with Vogt exploiting the fact that the German Social Democrats considered Marx their bête noire. Does that mean black beast? I don't know. Vogt tried to discredit Marx through statements to the effect that he was a police agent, lived off working men, and, quote, similar stupidities, end quote. Although Marx repeatedly emphasized that Vogt's libel would have to be refuted to vindicate the honor of their party, LaSalle hesitated to assist Marx in this affair. See the letter from Marx to LaSalle, November 14, 1859. LaSalle, on the other hand, had not refrained from speaking out in the name of the party when propagating his own views on the Italian War. Marx cautioned him henceforth to avoid actions which might provoke internal party disputes, quote, for public polemics are in no way advantageous for a party with such an inconsiderable membership, which I hope, however, redeems with its energy all that it loses through its number, end quote. November 22, 1859. New section, 1860. Only in January and February 1860 did Marx find a few short weeks to work again on his, quote, economics before being consumed by the Vogt affair, illness, and his journalism. He reread several authors, notably Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus. One second. He reread several authors, notably Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus, along with Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England, and studied a number of political classics, Locke, Montesquieu, The recently published, quote, reports of the inspectors of factories, 1855 to 59, end quote, served him both for the, quote, economics and for 2 articles which the Daily Tribune published in August. At the end of January, Lassalle reminded Marx of his promise to deliver the second installment, chapter 3 of the first of 6 books, by the end of 1859, and claimed to be personally interested in seeing it appear soon. Lassalle, who had ambitions to write on political economy as well, wrote frankly, quote, "Your book is much too important for me to publish a systematic treatment of the same topic, bracket, while you are, end bracket, in the middle of it without considerable misgivings," end quote. About January 27, 1860. Marx answered that Lassalle should wait until the second part had appeared before beginning his own writing, because this part was to contain the, quote, quintessence, end quote, of the subject to be elaborated in the 5 subsequent books. January 30th, 1860. Engels, too, was concerned that his friend should finish with the, quote, economics, and counseled him not to let the Vogt slander divert his attention from the main task. Moreover, he added, quote, for once do be a little less conscientious in your affairs. In any case, it will be too good for the lousy public. The main thing is that it materializes and is published. The weaknesses you notice, those asses won't find any," end quote. January 31st, 1860. At this time, Marx still thought that, quote, "If I apply myself to it resolutely, I can have it ready in 6 weeks, and after the trial it will be a success," end quote. To Engels, February 3rd, 1860. Marx had decided to bring legal action against the Berlin National Zeitung for publishing long excerpts from Vogt's pamphlet in leading articles. About January 24th to 27th, he was temporarily unable to procure it himself, but the first edition of 3,000 copies had already been sold out to a curious German public in search of sensation. As soon as he had the documents in question, he was determined to establish a case against both Vogt and the Berlin newspaper. Through the Urquhartites in London, Marx received the name of a Berlin lawyer who could advise him. He was convinced, however, that it would be necessary to write a counterattack against Vogt. As he explained to Zamora, quote, "This pamphlet contains the most absurd defamations against me that I see myself compelled to reply to his scandalous lies, even though it is a real shame to have to waste my time on such a wretched affair," end quote. January 30th, 1860. In February 1860, Marx began collecting documentary material, including letters attesting to his activities in the Communist League and elsewhere, to his friends, etc. He wrote dozens of letters seeking support from friends and acquaintances, and entrusted to Engels the preparation of the documents on the Communist League in the first years of exile. The London Daily Telegraph now republished Vogt's accusations under the headline, quote, "The Journalist Auxiliaries of Austria," end quote. Marx's letter demanding a retraction received a very evasive reply. On February 13th, Marx sent the first batch of documents and attestations to Justizrat Weber in Berlin. On February 24th, 1860, he wrote Weber a long and detailed letter on his professional and literary activities, following this with additional documents on March 3rd, 1860. From February 16th, 1860 to March 23rd, 1860, Marx was in Manchester with Engels and Wilhelm Wulff to discuss the plan for a pamphlet against Vogt. More information went off to Councillor Weber in March on Marx's relations with the Communist League, his occupations and sources of income since leaving Germany. Vogt claimed so. Marx wrote to Weber that he was the head of a secret band known variously as the Schwefelbande or the Bürstenheimer, and scattered throughout Europe following the 1848-49 revolutions. This group, which Marx was said to have reunited in the London emigration, engaged chiefly in extorting money from former participants in the 1846 rebellions under the threat of denunciation. Marx was also imagined to have been involved in a ring of counterfeiters in Switzerland in 1852 and 1859. Marx replied to these allegations with proof that he had abandoned all agitation in September 1850 and that the Communist League had itself been disbanded during the trials of 1851-52. For all the Schwefelbande and the Bürstenheimer, as for the Schwefelbande and the Burstenheimer. These were actually two very different Geneva societies, utterly unrelated to one another and to Marx and the Communist League. While the first group had nothing to do with politics whatsoever, it was a drinking club. The second was a working men's educational association. As Marx summed up this affair to the Polish emigrants, Joachim Lelavel, quote, "On the one hand, bracket, Vogt, end bracket, depicts me as an insignificant person, and on the other, imputes the basest motives to me. He is falsifying my entire past," end quote. Marx, 1860, February 3rd. A sharp dispute arose between Marx and his, quote, old party friend and longtime personal friend, end quote, Ferdinand Freiligrath, who had ignored Marx's first two letters asking for support in the Vogt case. Writing for the third time, Marx appealed to Freiligrath's sense of personal responsibility, explaining the importance of the legal action as, quote, decisive for the historical vindication of the party and for its later position in Germany, end quote. What Marx did not want, however, was to cause an estrangement between himself and one of his oldest friends because of Vogt. Quote, "If we are both conscious of having waved the banner for the, quote, classe le plus laborieuse et la plus misérable," end quote, high over the heads of the Philistines during these many years, each in his own way, placing personal interest in the background and with the purest motives, I would consider it a petty sin against history for us to be set at variance over trivialities, which are all reducible to misunderstandings, end quote. February 23rd, 1860. Freiligrath, who was in a position to vindicate both Marx and the party in this affair, replied that he had no desire whatsoever to get involved in Marx's polemics and protested, quote, out of a feeling for purity, end quote, against any further association of his name with the party, quote, "The party, too, is a cage," end quote. The poet Freiligrath wrote, quote, "And the singing is better, even when it is for the party on the outside than on the inside," end quote. February 26, 1860. This interpretation of, quote, "the party," end quote, as Freiligrath used the term, Marx had to be totally false. Quote, "Party," end quote, as a secret political organization had ceased to exist for Marx in 1852. What Marx was referring to was, quote, "party in the eminent historical sense," end quote, which he was serving through his theoretical writings in the belief that they would achieve more in the long run than participation in any of the political groups that had now outlived their effectiveness. Marx reminded Freiligrath of his own important role in the League as contrasted to his present occupation in a bank. The League had a, quote, excellent position, end quote, for its, quote, purity in 19th century history. As for trade and commerce, however, their impurity was really, quote, in its natural place, end quote. Quote, "The honorable villainy of the villainous honorability," quote, "the honorable villainy or the villainous honorability of solvent, morality, does not rank a whit above the irrespectable villainy which tainted both the earliest Christian communities and the Jacobin clubs as well as our erstwhile League. It's just that in bourgeois commerce one generally comes to lose one's feelings for respectable villainy or villainous respectability," end quote. February 29th, 1860. With this, both the issue and the Marx-Freiligrath friendship came to an end. Lassalle, too, gave Marx reason to doubt the meaning of their friendship as he wrote that he had found, quote, much truth, end quote, in Vogt's pamphlet and gave only timid suggestions for its refutation. In April, Lassalle sent Marx a copy of still another of his publications and reported that his economics, as well as 3 other works, were already, quote, outlined in his mind. As if that were not enough, Lassalle stated that he was pursuing, quote, 4 to 5 sciences, end quote, with the intention of being productive in each of them. April 16, 1860. During the Vogt affair, Marx wrote only occasionally for the Daily Tribune, while Engels contributed numerous reports on military affairs and produced a sequel to the Po and Rhine pamphlet entitled Savoy, Nice, and the Rhine. Marx's main topics for his articles were foreign relations, Franco-English, Franco-Prussian, Austro-Russian, etc. He also treated the popular uprising in Sicily, commerce, banking, and factory conditions in England. In connection with the Vogt affair, Charles Dana wrote for Marx a letter attesting to his personal and professional integrity during 9 years of collaboration on the New York paper. In Dana's words, Marx was, quote, not only one of the most highly valued, but one of the best paid contributors attached to the journal. The only fault I have had to find with you has been that you have occasionally exhibited too German a tone of feeling for an American newspaper. This has been the case with reference both to Russia and to France. In questions relating to both Tsarism and Bonapartism, I have sometimes thought that you manifested too much interest and too great anxiety for the unity and independence of Germany." End quote. Marx. No, not Marx, Jesus Christ. End quote. Charles Dana. Jesus Christ. I'm a mess today. When writing on British foreign policy, Marx continued to strike at Palmerston, who, after being censored by Parliament for arbitrarily declaring the Second Chinese War, undertook the third, quote, "in spite of Parliament, ... as if to try the strength of ministerial irresponsibility, wielding the rights of Parliament against the Crown, prerogative of the Crown against Parliament, and the privileges of both against the people," end quote. February 14th, 1860. The difference between French policy-making and British, Marx wrote, was, quote, "imperialist usurpation," end quote, on the one hand, and, quote, "ministerial usurpation," end quote, on the other. Quote, from Berlin, end quote, Marx reported on the revolutionary feelings at all social levels. With the people now distrustful of the regent for his blindness in foreign policy, Berlin had become, quote, "the most revolutionary city in Europe," end quote, with the possible exceptions of Palmero and Vienna, April 28, 1860. Faulty policies in domestic as well as in foreign affairs had isolated Prussia from its German neighbors and from all of Europe. Had it continued with the institutional and legal reforms brought by the 1848 revolution, Prussia, quote, "would have commanded the sympathies of all Germany, Austrian Germany included. As it is, she had only divided the German princes without uniting the German people. She has, in fact, opened the door by which to let in the Zouaves," end quote. May 19, 1860. Rumors were circulating that Napoleon III was preparing to attack the Prussian Rhineland. The threat of war over the Rhine frontier was central to Engels' discussion of military questions in the pamphlet Savoy, Nice, and the Rhine in February 1860, in which he destroyed theoretically the traditional doctrine of the, quote, "natural frontiers," end quote. France, which was desirous of annexing Savoy and Nice, might use the same arguments legitimizing the incorporation of these areas to justify the annexation of French Switzerland as well. Should France succeed in gaining these lands, the old doctrine of, quote, "natural frontiers," end quote, would be affirmed, thereby justifying France's aggression in the Rhineland. However, behind the scenes of this battling over frontiers and border regions, Engels pointed out, was Russia, pulling the strings so that others would shed blood while she might expand her territory towards Constantinople, quote, "the fixed goal of Russian foreign policy," end quote. Russia could have found no better man than Louis Napoleon to help execute these expansionist plans and attack Germany. Traditional, although often indirect victims of Russian aggression, manipulators' hegemony in the affairs of Europe. Engels produced a long list of Russian, quote, "sins," end quote, against Germany and emphasized that, quote, "Russia threatens and insults us constantly, and when Germany rises up against this, Russia puts the French gendarme into action by holding out the prospect of the left bank of the Rhine," end quote. However, Germany's new comrade in arms, the Russian serf, was going to create a revolution which would change the whole structure of Russian society, topple the Tsar, and with him the present system of foreign policy. In connection with the question of serf emancipation in Russia, Marx had commented to Engels in a letter of January 11th that, quote, "in my opinion, the greatest that is happening in today's world is on the one hand the American slave movement ushered in by Brown's death, on the other the slave movement in Russia, ... Thus the, quote, social, end quote, movement in West and East had begun. This, together with the impending downbreak, in Central Europe, is going to be magnificent," end quote. Marx, 1860. Answering a letter from LaSalle, Marx explained in detail his relations with and attitude towards David Urquhart and the London Urquhartites. He characterized Urquhart as a man of, quote, "subjective, reactionary," end quote, personal views, but said that his orientation in foreign policy was, quote, "objective, revolutionary," end quote. Most important of all, Urquhart was a, quote, "power which Russia fears," end quote. Quote, "He is the sole official man in England who has the courage and the honesty to offer resistance to public opinion. He is the only incorruptible one, either through money or ambition amongst them," end quote. About June 2nd, 1860. Because the Urquhartites pursued a anti-Russian foreign policy, The revolutionary group should nurture an alliance with them without hesitating, nonetheless, to oppose them on matters of domestic policy. In the summer, Marx received notification from Weber in Berlin that his libel suit against the editors of the Berlin National Zeitung had been rejected by the municipal court. An appeal to a higher court was turned down on July 29, 1860, and on a final appeal, the High Court rejected the suit on October 23, 1860. Despite frequent illness, Marx continued to put together his pamphlet against Vogt, did occasional readings for the, quote, economics, Sismondi, Tucker, Bellers, and the Physiocrats, and contributed to the Daily Tribune until the end of November 1860. In the Factory Inspector's reports used as the basis for two articles on August 6, 1860 and August 24, 1860, Marx discovered that in industries where working hours were prescribed by law, wages had risen, whereas in the absence of health laws and protective labor laws, accident rates had risen in other industrial branches. The most interesting part of the report treated the development and spread of cooperatives in the spinning industry. Commenting the outbreak of disturbances in Syria, August 11th, 1860, Marx pointed out that the Tsar saw external collisions as a means of creating a certain national unity and averting an internal corruption in his country. Quote, "It is evident that the autocrat of France and the autocrat of Russia, laboring both under the same urgent necessity of sounding the war trumpet, act in common court." End quote. In this and other articles, Marx echoed Engels' warnings of Russian aggression, Savoy, Nice, and the Rhine, and appeal to the Germans to resist the Tsar's attempt to manipulate European politics. Germany was, quote, "a lamentable spectacle," end quote, he wrote, for it imagined that a treaty with Russia would protect it from French aggression. Quote, "Russian foreign policy, as is well known, does not care one straw for principles in the common meaning of the term. It is neither legitimist nor revolutionary, but improves all opportunities of territorial aggrandizement with the same faculty, ... End quote. October 10th. Where am I? Only an international revolution in Germany, an internal revolution in Germany would shatter the Habsburg Empire without endangering the territorial integrity and would establish the unity and freedom essential in order to resist further foreign aggression. On Sicily too, Marx foresaw a revolution that would arise from a national movement as the product of reflection and action and not of change. October 15, 1860. In September and November 1860, Marx reported on the pending agricultural crisis. A bad harvest combined with serious monetary difficulties might well lead to political instability and even revolution, this time in England. Efforts to find a German publisher for the Vogt pamphlet proved futile, and Marx therefore decided to have it issued in German by the London publisher Albert Petsch. He was moved to do so by the lower printing costs. Petsch, Lassalle, Borkheim, and Engels were willing to assume a part of the expenses, and the assurance that the consignments to be sent to Germany would not be confiscated, as had happened with the pamphlets on the Cologne communist trial. The next of Marx's, quote, literary reply, end quote, to Vogt left the press on November 30th. In the, quote, preface to Herr Vogt, Marx explained that the first part of the text dealing with Vogt's personal attacks against himself was included only after the Berlin courts had refused to hear the case against the National Zeitung. Had there been a public trial, Marx would have had the opportunity to vindicate himself and his career and the reputation of the party whose interest he represented. In refuting Vogt's, quote, tall stories, end quote, Marx tracked down the actual facts about the Schwefelbande and the Burstenheimer, documenting his revelations with letters furnished by former members of the two groups. S.L. Borkheim, for instance, described the Schwefelbande as a circle of young people in the Swiss emigration whose chief activity was to dispel their gloom in taverns and wine cellars drinking on credit. By contrast, Marx depicted the, quote, December 10th gang, end quote, around Napoleon III as, quote, the scum, offal dregs of all classes, end quote. quote, a, quote, welfare society, end quote, insofar as all its members and Bonaparte as well felt the need to do something for their own welfare at the expense of the laboring nation, end quote. Marx presented a letter written to him by a well-known Russian writer, N.I. Sazonov, expressing both the writer's indignation at the calumnies spread by Vogt and his high esteem for Marx's thought. Quote, your success among thinking men is immense, and if it pleases you to know what response your doctrines have found in Russia, I should like to tell you that at the beginning of this year, Professor I.K. Babst held a public lecture course on political economy in Moscow, and the first of these lectures was simply a paraphrasing of your recent publication, end quote. May 10th, 1860. To disprove Vogt's statements about the Communist League, the trial in Cologne, and his theoretical writings on communism, Marx gave a lengthy account of the events of his career in exile. Vogt had asserted, in quoting a letter from Tchehov, who had participated in the 1848 revolution in Berlin, that Marx had concocted a, quote, a proletarian catechism, end quote, in the Communist Manifesto made to measure for the proletariat. Marx replied that, quote, ... on the contrary, I repudiated all systems. In the, quote, manifesto, which was destined for the working class as well, and replaced them with, quote, the critical understanding of the conditions, the trend, and the general results of the social movement, end quote. Such, quote, understanding, end quote, can be neither imitated blindly nor, quote, made to measure, end quote, like a cartridge pouch, end quote. Marx then recounted the incidents which provoked Vogt's insidious attack on Marx, beginning with the conversation he had had with Blind in May 1859. He undertook to prove the validity of the statement confirmed by Blind that Vogt was a paid agent of Napoleon III. His own views on Bonaparte, Marx added, had been elaborated in detail by Engels in the two pamphlets The Po and the Rhine and Savoy, Nice, and the Rhineland, and differed radically from the pro-Bonaparte propaganda diffused by Vogt. In Bonaparte, Vogt saw a, quote, friend of the people, end quote, and held that Russia's sympathy for France was ample evidence of the liberalism of Bonapartist politics. Moreover, Russia was for Vogt the, quote, friend of emancipatory endeavors, end quote. These statements contrasted sharply to the actual history of Russian diplomacy and the foreign relations between Russia and Europe, for Russia was actually striving to create a great Slavic empire. According to Vogt, Poland would be merged with Russia, quote, through free self-determination, end quote, while Hungary would have to be subjected to Russian domination. Marx declared, however, that Russia was not only a threat to the Poles and the Hungarians, she threatened the existence of Germany as a nation as well. Vogt's position on these questions of Polish and Hungarian independence, on German unity, and his confidence of Russia reflected his primary allegiance to Bonaparte. Marx had hardly finished writing the preface to Herr Vogt when Jenny became seriously ill with smallpox, November 19, 1860. The children were taken in by the Liebknecht family while Marx tended his wife, unable to write, unable to read. Quote, in order to maintain the necessary tranquility of mind, end quote, he began studying mathematics. Letter to Engels, November 23, 1860. In December 1860, as his wife was recovering, Marx read Darwin's work on the origin of species, published in 1859, and reported to Engels that, quote, although elaborated in a crude English manner, this is the book that contains the biological basis of our conceptions, end quote. Marx, December 19, 1860. New section, 1861. Another year began for Marx beset with illness and financial troubles, symptoms of the bourgeois misère, which continued to plague the family in exile. Marx's income was seldom above that of a Manchester worker. He was chronically afflicted with hepatitis, and his wife was still weak from the smallpox. Because of political developments in the USA, Charles Donna suspended Marx's articles for 6 weeks, and as for the future, he would be commissioned to write only one article a week, as he confessed to Engels, quote, how am I supposed to carry on here? I do not know, for taxes, school, house, grocer, butcher, God, and the devil don't want to give me any further respite, ... I I don't know what I should do, but I have seen this crisis approaching for some time now, end quote. January 29th, 1861. Marx finally decided to go to Holland to speak about financial matters with his uncle Lyon Phillips, who managed the affairs of Henrietta Marx. Preoccupied with procuring a pass from a friend and scraping up enough money to finance the trip, he was too busy even to read the daily papers. In the evenings, he reported to Engels he was reading Appian's work on the Roman civil wars in the original Greek and commented on this, quote, very worthwhile book, end quote, which explained the materialist basis of these conflicts. Quote, Spartacus appears as the most splendid fellow that the whole of ancient history has to offer. A great general, no Garibaldi, noble character, real representative of the ancient proletariat, end quote. February 27, 1861. In the meantime, it gradually became evident that the publication of Herr Vogt had aroused little interest in Germany. Very little echo was heard in the press, where Marx's writings seemed to have been placed under a, quote, conspiratorial ban of silence, end quote. Lassalle read it and admitted that he had been too hasty in criticizing Marx. Quote, your conviction that Vogt had been bribed by Bonaparte is entirely justified and in order, end quote. Letter to Marx, January 19, 1861. He did nothing, however, to publicize or promote the sale of the pamphlet, which was later banned in France, Marx to Engels, May 16, 1861. On February 28, 1861, Marx went to Saltbommel in Holland, where he visited the Phillips family and succeeded in taking his uncle into an advance of £160 on his maternal inheritance. From there, he traveled to Berlin to discuss the possibility of founding a new party journal with Lassalle. Since the project would demand Marx's renaturalization as a Prussian citizen, he gave Lassalle a power of attorney to undertake the necessary steps on his behalf, but reserved a final decision on the matter until he had conferred with Engels and Wilhelm Wulff. His impression from this one-month stay with Lassalle in Berlin are recorded in a number of letters to his cousin Nanette Phillips and to Engels. Upon his arrival in the Prussian capital, where he found to have a, quote, upon his arrival in the Prussian capital, which he found to have, quote, a bold and frivolous atmosphere, end quote, Marx was introduced to his host lady friend, the Countess Sophie Hatzfeldt. She reminded him, Marx wrote to Nanette, quote, of some Greek statues which still boast a fine bust, but whose heads have been cruelly, quote, beknappered. I think that's what it says. Beknappered. Beknappered, end quote, by the vicissitudes of time. Still not to be unjust, she is a very distinguished lady, deeply interested in the revolutionary movements, and of an aristocratic laissez-aller, very superior to the pedantic grimace of professional femme d'esprit. March 24th, 1861. Together with Lassalle and the Countess, Marx attended a performance of the Berlin comedy. Quote, altogether a disgusting affair, end quote, he wrote to Nanette, and a ballet, which he found, quote, deadly dull, end quote. From the reporter's box, Marx also witnessed a session of the Second Chamber of Deputies in Berlin. In a letter to Engels on May 10, 1861, he described the scene as a, quote, curious mixture of an office of bureaucrats and a schoolroom, end quote. Twice during his stay, Marx went out to the taverns with his old friend Karl Friedrich Kupen and found these rendezvous, quote, a real blessing, end quote, after Lassalle, quote, who would, for example, think he had been victimized if he ever set foot in a pub, end quote. Kupen presented Marx with a copy of his two-volume work on the religion of Buddha and its genesis. From the Countess Hatzfeldt, Marx learned that, in the highest military circles of Berlin, Engels' anonymous pamphlet on the Po and the Rhine was considered to be the work of an unknown Prussian general. While he found the atmosphere in Berlin, quote, boding ill for the powers that be, end quote, Marx was not attracted by the prospect of returning there to live. He confided to Nanette that, quote, if I were quite free, and if, besides, I were not bothered by something you may call, quote, political conscience, end quote, I should never have England I should never leave England for Germany, and still less for Prussia, and least of all for that affreux Berlin, with its, quote, sand, and its, quote, Bildung, and, quote, seinen überwitzigen Leuten, end quote. April 13th, 1861. On his return to London, Marx stopped over for a short visit with his mother in Trier, April 19th to 20th, 1861. Although unwilling to give him any direct financial aid, she did nonetheless release him from a number of outstanding debts. Quote, the old woman interested me, end quote, wrote Lassalle, quote, because of her fine spirit and the indestructible sameness of her character, end quote. May 8th, 1861. He then went to Holland to, quote, conduct business, end quote, with his uncle and to, quote, court, end quote, his cousin Nanette, arriving finally in London on April 29th. In the early part of the year, Engels had contributed 2 articles to the Daily Tribune and subsequently began writing for the Volunteer Journal from Lancashire and Cheshire on military affairs. In the Daily Tribune on February 12th, Engels predicted a European war instigated by Prussia against Denmark for possession of Schleswig-Holstein. Such a war would eventually lead to a revolution and, should Napoleon be defeated, would cause his downfall. A German revolution, moreover, would result in the case of a Prussian defeat, toppling both the Prussian and the Austrian rulers. Engels later provided Marx with essential information on military matters for subsequent articles in the Daily Tribune and the Vienna Presse. In mid-May 1861, Marx helped organize a meeting in London to protest against the arrest and brutal treatment of Auguste Blanqui by the French police. He wrote to the Countess Hatzfeldt, asking her to help by having information published in the German press. Thanks to these efforts, news of the Blanqui affair was subsequently published in American and Italian, as well as German papers. Marx later received an expression of Blanqui's deep gratitude for the sympathy he and the, quote, German proletarian party, end quote, had shown him. To this Marx replied, quote, no one could be more interested than I in the fate of a man whom I have always held to be the head and heart of the proletarian party in France, end quote. Letter to Louis Vatu, November 10th, 1861. One second. In June 1861, Marx recommenced his reading for the, quote, economics, but not until August did he begin working on the 3rd chapter and filled a notebook with material on, quote, the transformation of money into capital, end quote. In September, he worked on the 2 parts of the transformation process, in October 1861 on absolute surplus value, and in November on relative surplus value, on cooperation and division of labor. On July 1st, 1861, Lassalle informed Marx that he had written a letter to the publisher F.A. Brockhaus, assuring him that the, quote, economics would be a success thanks to Marx's, quote, masterly skill, end quote, in political economy. He had recommended that Brockhaus print the coming work not as a continuation of the first booklet, but as a separate and complete work. Brockhaus agreed to consider the work when he had the completed manuscript before him. Lassalle urged Marx to finish as soon as possible. In the same letter, Marx was informed that the Prussian government had turned down his request for renaturalization on the grounds that Marx had not led a, quote, reputable life, end quote, his disreputableness consisting of a, quote, way of thinking, end quote, that was, quote, republican or at least not of royalist nature, end quote. In his statement to the Royal Police President on April 6, 1861, Marx had demanded reinstatement as a Prussian citizen on the basis that his renunciation in 1845 had been purely formal, provoked by external pressures, and that he had never seriously desired to give up his citizenship. After receiving Lassalle's latest book, System der Erworbenen Rechte, Marx carried on a lengthy discussion with the author on the adoption of the institution of the Roman Testament in modern legal systems. Marx held that the paradoxical adoption of Roman legal forms in modern society was attributable to the fact that, quote, the legal conceptions which the subject of free competition has of himself corresponds to that of the Roman person, And here I do not want to go into the very essential point that the legal conception of certain production relations, inasmuch as the conception does derive from them, still does not correspond to them. Bracket, letter to LaSalle, July 22nd, 1861. The Roman Testament was adopted by Western jurists through misunderstanding. Similarly, the Greek form of drama was adopted in contemporary French theater, and the English Constitution, in a misunderstood form, came to be the form of other modern constitutions. Marx concluded that, quote, the misunderstood form is precisely the general and at a certain stage of social development, the one which is universally applicable, end quote. In September, Marx again took up work for the Daily Tribune and simultaneously started as a correspondent for the Vienna Presse. His chief topic in current events was the American Civil War and its economic repercussions in Europe. He also exchanged numerous letters with Engels on the war and reported that, as he saw it, quote, the conflict between North and South after the latter had degraded itself in the past 50 years, with concession after concession, has finally come to a head, ... owing to the weight thrown into the balance by the extraordinary development of the northwestern states, end quote. July 1st, 1861. The secessionist movement was, moreover, no popular movement at all, but a, quote, usurpation, end quote, whose goal was to, quote, strengthen and increase the oligarchic power of 300,000 southern slave lords against 5 million whites, ... end quote. In his first article on the war for the Daily Tribune, Marx sought to define the motives of the opposing parties. The South, he said, was fighting for the liberty to enslave other people, having recognized in slavery, quote, a good thing in itself and a bulwark of civilization and a divine institution, end quote. The North, on the other hand, was fighting to retain the Union only indirectly for the abolition of the institution which divided the country. October 11th, 1861. Although alone, the economic law of slavery necessitated its diffusion over an ever-growing expanse of territory, the Southern leaders recognized that to maintain their social system, they would also have to retain their political sway over the United States. In England, meanwhile, the possibility of a Southern defeat was causing great consternation in the British cotton industry, which itself was built on a twofold system of slavery. Quote, the indirect slavery of the white man in England and the direct slavery of the black man on the other side of the Atlantic, end quote. Marx, New York Daily Tribune, October 14th, 1861. For the Vienna Presse, Marx treated the attitudes on the American war as expressed in the British press. In Britain, the argument was often advanced that the North should not interfere with the South's decision to separate. Marx retorted that the two sections of the country were neither independent lands nor distinct geographical regions nor moral unities, and that, in short, quote, the South, end quote, ... is not a country at all, but a battle slogan, end quote. November 7th, 1861. This is a struggle between social systems and not one of national independence. At all costs, Marx noted, America must avoid open conflict with England, something which Palmerston certainly wished to see, for the only one to profit from such a complication would be Napoleon III. November 6, 1861. When European intervention in Mexico became a major issue in contemporary affairs, Marx wrote on this topic for both the Daily Tribune and the Presse. He termed this aggression, quote, a contrivance of the true Palmerston make, end quote, distinguished by its, quote, insanity of purpose, end quote, and the, quote, imbecility of the means deployed, end quote. New York Daily Tribune, November 23rd, 1861. An optimal moment for European intervention had been provided by the American War, and 3 European nations involved were bent on reconstituting their hegemony in the new order and on colonial expansion, while claiming to restore order to Mexico. Now that he had resumed his journalism, Marx hoped to, quote, gain solid ground under his feet, end quote, in the financial struggle to support himself and his family, and also anticipated finishing his book on capital before long. See letters to Engels, October 30th, 1861. These hopes, however, proved premature. To the family's accumulated debts and the loss of income during the first half of this year came costs for printing Herr Vogt, which had to be repaid to the publisher. Marx was forced to write his friends and relatives for any aid whatever. His mother refused to help. The landlord threatened eviction. He was being sued for payment of the revoked printing costs. His wife was ailing. The presser was printing not even half the articles he sent them. Quote, "My best wishes for the new year," end quote, he wrote to Engels and added, quote, "If the new is like the old, for my part, it can go to the devil," end quote. October 27th, 1861. 1862. A year of the most disheartening, this is a new section, I forgot to say. New section, 1862. A year of the most disheartening material suffering for the Marx family, and yet at the same time one in which Marx made astonishing progress on his, quote, economics. After reducing his contributions to a minimum in the past year, the Daily Tribune in March gave up Marx altogether as their London correspondent in view of the growing dimensions of the Civil War. His financial situation was not helped by the fact that the press scarcely printed an average of one article by him a week, although he sent 4 or 5. The year's work on the, quote, economics filled 13 notebooks, numbers 5 to 18, and began with the material and surplus value theory, which belonged according to the plan of 1858 to 59 in the 3rd chapter of the first, quote, book. He then started a section on the history of surplus value theories to be appended to the theoretical material in notebooks 1 to 5, equal to chapter 3. Just as he had done for the first 2 chapters published in 1859, the material in notebooks 1 to 5, along with 19 to 33, written in 1863, constituted the first rough draft of Book 1 of Capital, while 6 to 15 contained a detailed critique of the history of political economy from the standpoint of surplus value, and a number of passages on productivity and unproductive labor not elaborated elsewhere in Marx's writings. Notebooks 16 to 18 deal with capital and profit rates, merchants' capital, and money capital. The historical section of the theories of surplus value treat in particular the theories of Stuart, the physiocrats Adam Smith, Quinet, Necker, Linguet, Bray, Rodbertus, Ricardo, Malthus, etc., and is, quote, embellished, end quote, with occasional digressions on related topics. There, for example, Marx's theory of ground rent is developed. The Civil War in America continued to be a central theme in his reports to the Presse, and until March 1862, to the Daily Tribune as well. He was especially concerned with the political and economic effects of the war for the industrial working class in England, which was most directly and seriously affected by the Southern blockade. Marx confirmed that, quote, the anti-war movement is expanding and gathering force from day to day, end quote. At public meetings throughout the country, the working people were demanding that the Anglo-American conflict over the Trent incident be settled by arbitration. Die Presse, January 5, 1862. Without official parliamentary representation, the English working class nevertheless exerted considerable influence on the government through, quote, pressure from without, end quote, great extra-parliamentary popular demonstrations, end quote, while the government waited for, quote, the intervention cry from below, end quote. The suffering working men in Britain remained true to the emancipatory struggle in America, the country with the world's only popular government. Quote, this is a new, brilliant proof of the indestructible excellence which is the secret of England's greatness, and which, to speak in the hyperbolic language of Mazzini, made the common English soldier seem a demigod during the Crimean War and the Indian insurrection, end quote. February 2nd, 1862. Even apart from political questions, the Englishman's character interested Marx, in particular as it was affected by industrialization. On February 9, 1862, he wrote for Die Presse on the traditional view of the Englishman as, quote, original or, quote, individualist. However, the Englishman of the past was not the man of modern-day industrial England whose national character had resulted from the development of class differences, specialization in labor, and, quote, the so-called, quote, public opinion, end quote, manipulated by the Brahmins of the press, end quote. Out of this, a national, quote, monotony of character, end quote, had arisen such that Shakespeare would no longer recognize his countrymen. Character differences, Marx wrote, quote, are no longer property individuals as such, but to their, quote, profession, end quote, and class. Outside of the professions, in daily intercourse, one, quote, respectable, end quote, Englishman so closely resembles another that even Leibniz would scarcely be able to discover a difference between them, end quote. February 9th, 1862. Following the government's fever for active intervention in the American conflict, Mexico had become the focal point of interventionist hopes. Marx remarked that without an official declaration of war, England, together with Spain and France, set out to, quote, cow a half-defenseless country into submission, end quote. De Pressa, February 12, 1862. Not until the end of February did Marx write to Engels explaining that his long silence was not, quote, from within, end quote, but from the misery of circumstances I didn't want to bore and to bother you with, end quote. February 25, 1862. Added to the never-ending financial problems with rent, debts to the neighborhood shopkeepers, legal suits, etc., Marx now had the worry of little Jenny's health. Quote, Jenny is now so far along that she feels the whole muck and misery of our circumstances, and that I think is one of the main reasons for her physical suffering, end quote. He wrote to Engels and then added despondently, quote, taken all in all then, it is in fact not worthwhile to lead such a lousy life, end quote. Engels reported that he too was forced to reduce his living standard because of the American crisis and that the factory was operating only at half power. He collaborated with Marx on a two-part article published in Die Presse on March 26 and 27, 1862, which pointed up the enormous dimensions of the American conflict, quote, a spectacle without parallel in the annals of military history, end quote. Quote, new in the eyes of the European onlooker, end quote. From the end of March 1862, Marx spent nearly a month with Engels in Manchester, and, of course, on his return, the family's debts for the, quote, immediate necessities of life, end quote, for the rent, the children's piano lessons, etc., had increased still further. He mentioned his predicament in a letter to LaSalle in order to avoid the possibility of the latter's misunderstanding his protracted silence. Quote, I am therefore in a total vacuum, but I don't want to chant you any sort of litany. It is a wonder that I haven't gone completely mad, end quote. April 28, 1862. With all these interruptions and preoccupations of a material nature, Marx remarked that he was often unable to write even a line for the, quote, economics. Moreover, quote, I have the peculiar habit that when I see a finished manuscript in front of me after 4 weeks, I find that it is no longer good enough, and then I rework it again entirely, end quote. LaSalle, who was angered about Marx's long silence, promised nonetheless to write a critique of the first installment of Marx's, quote, economics, June 9, 1862, but failed to be true to his word. Early in June 1862, Marx received still another recent work by the prolific LaSalle, entitled Herr Julian Schmidt der Literatur Historiker, published March 1862. Writing to thank the author, Marx took up the problem of, quote, sophos, end quote, the, quote, particular character mask, end quote, of Greek philosophy and ideal of Epicureans, Stoics, and skeptics. Quote, it is characteristic of modern philosophy that the Greek combination of character and knowledge contained in sophos was retained in the popular consciousness only by sophists, end quote. June 16, 1862. He also discussed at length the two works by Rodbertus and by Roscher, which LaSalle had lent him in Berlin for his studies in economics. Rodbertus's refutation of Ricardo's doctrine of ground rent and the construction of a new rent theory, published in 1851, won Marx's approval except for the proposed new rent theory, which he characterized as, quote, rather childish, ridiculous, end quote, although admitting that it did tend in the right direction. Roscher, on the other hand, was for Marx a, quote, pompous eclectic, end quote, who lacked the intellectual honesty necessary to arrive at self-instruction and therefore continued in the role of the professional, quote, professorial student, end quote. Were Roscher to admit that contradictions do exist, and were Roscher to admit that contradictions do exist, and were he conscientious in view of the tasks at hand, quote, he would be useful to his students. The students would, on the one hand, receive a certain amount of material, and on the other, they would be inspired to independent study, end quote. So, just to give you an update, I just read for like an hour and a half, and I realized that I didn't press record. but I'm going to carry on from where I realized that I stopped recording and then go back and reread later what I missed. I want you to just know that I'm extremely angry. My face was blood red. I'm just kidding. It wasn't a bad read, so I don't care. Anyway, the World's Fair had begun in London. It was a time of amusement and gay outings, but the Marx family could share in none of this. Clothing redeemed in April from the pawnbrokers was again pledged in June for a few pounds to buy food. Jenny tried to sell a part of her husband's library, and when this plan fell through, Marx confessed to Engels the depths of their present misery. Quote, "My wife tells me every day that she would prefer lying with the children in the grave, and indeed I cannot blame her for feeling so for the humiliations, anguish, and fear which must be withstood, or truly because her feeling for the humiliations, anguish, and fear which must be withstood are truly indescribable." End quote. Marx, June 18th, 1862. Nevertheless, Marx continued to make great progress with the, quote, economics, which he was now expanding to a thick manuscript to please the Germans who, quote, judge the value of books according to their volume, end quote. Actually, when I was reading, I was watching an interview with Michael Heinrich recently, and he was talking about his biography of Marx and how, like, the first two books are relatively slim compared to the next couple that are coming out. And he said that, Germans are known to like thick books and to write thick books, and in that sense, I'm a typical German, which it's funny to actually hear this stereotype about Germans enjoying large books again. To Engels, he announced that he had cleared up the difficulties with the theory of ground rent and had also discovered Ricardo's error. June 18, 1862. Work was then interrupted by the visit of Ferdinand Lassalle and his countess, who had come to London for the fair on July 9th. Marx's conversation with his guest frequently degenerated into outright disputes, and he found that since their meeting in Berlin, Lassalle had become a, quote, megalomaniac, a, quote, enlightened Bonapartist, end quote. In his letter to Engels, Marx referred to Lassalle as a, quote, Jewish nigger, end quote, who, quote, would rather throw his money in the dirt than lend it to a, quote, friend, end quote, even if he were to have a guarantee for the capital and interest, end quote. July 30th, 1862. Knowing the crisis Marx was in, Lassalle, quote, had the impertinence, end quote, to ask if one of Marx's daughters would not care to be a companion for the Countess Hatzfeld. Quote, to keep up appearances in front of this fellow, my wife had to carry off to the pawnbrokers everything that wasn't nailed down, end quote, Marx added. The situation was so desperate, however, that Marx was nevertheless pleased to receive a loan of 15 pounds from Lassalle, along with the promise that he might draw a bill on Lassalle for any amount, provided a third party would guarantee to cover him. This financial affair soon brought about the crucial conflict between the two men when Lassalle demanded a written promise to pay from Engels for a bill Marx had drawn and intimated that the affair might lead to a disastrous collision in Lassalle's, quote, bourgeois, end quote, life. During the summer, Marx again read Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, where he this time noticed Darwin's application of the Malthusian theory to the plant and animal kingdom, whereas Malthus had developed this principle expressly for human society. For Darwin, the beasts and plants reflected English society with its, quote, division of labor, competition, the opening of new markets, quote, inventions, end quote, and the Malthusian, quote, struggle for existence, end quote. It is Hobbes' bellum omnium contra omnis, or omn, and war of all against all, and reminds me of Hegel in the, quote, phenomenology, end quote, where bourgeois society figures as a, quote, intellectual animal kingdom, end quote, while in Darwin the animal kingdom figures as bourgeois society, end quote. Marx to Engels, June 18th, 1862. After Lassalle's departure in August, Marx went to see his uncle in Salzbaumel, hoping to procure the funds which would help the family survive its precarious situation. This time his efforts were in vain. In London once again, Marx tried to get work in a railway office, but was turned down because of his illegible handwriting. The only steady source of income for the family was the £1 a week which the Vienna Presse paid for his journalism. As earlier, the articles he wrote for Die Presse were principally concerned with the American conflict. He discussed the conduct and probable outcome of the war in correspondence with Engels and entertained the view that the Yankees would have to change their tactics from, quote, constitutional to, quote, revolutionary if they were to be victorious. A, quote, constitutional manner of conducting war, Marx noted, was to be expected of a, quote, bourgeois republic, end quote, like America, quote, where swindle has reigned sovereign for so long, end quote. September 10th, 1862. He expected nonetheless that the North would succeed because of the untenable economic basis of Southern expansionist demands in the border states and the West. Engels, on the contrary, gave greater weight to the superior militarism and the tactical victories of the Southerners, who seemed to, quote, be heroes in contrast to the sloppy management in the North, end quote. September 9th, 1862. For his Austrian readers, Marx wrote an interesting article on Abraham Lincoln in Die Presse, October 12, 1862, characterizing the American president as a plebeian, quote, without special greatness of character, without exceptional significance, end quote, but a man who proved that, given an advanced social and political organization as was found in the United States, quote, average men with goodwill suffice to do the tasks for which heroes are needed in the old world, end quote. Marx also came to speak of the problems of the British cotton industry, which, because of the American crisis, were forced to turn many working men out to the streets. While the cotton lords accumulated speculative wealth, the state supported and conserved the most precarious, precious part of their wealth, the worker. For capital, Marx noted, was composed essentially of the, quote, well-disciplined working men's armies of Lancashire and Yorkshire, end quote. September 27, 1862. In a further article concerning industrial Britain, Marx remarked on the introduction of large-scale factory methods in the baking industry and termed this, quote, the turning point in the history of big industry as it storms the refuge of medieval craftsmanship, end quote. October 30th, 1862. In November, Marx wrote to Lassalle on the matter of the bill which had been drawn on the latter and was due to be presented for payment November 12th. He admitted having been overly sensitive to Lassalle's caution in this affair, and that his letter of August 20th had contained unwarranted sarcasm and criticism. He had not wished to sacrifice their friendship over a matter of money. Quote, I think that the substantial element of our friendship is strong enough to withstand even such a shock. I must admit to you, sans phrase, that sitting as I am on a keg of dynamite, I let myself go to an extent that was unfitting for an animal rationale. Animal rationale, I guess rational animal, is that what that means? In any event, it would not be very generous of you as a jurist and prosecuting attorney to use against me this state of mind in which I would most prefer to shoot a bullet through my head. End quote. November 7th, 1862. Despite this bill, Marx was unable to make ends meet during the winter. A, quote, call for aid, end quote, went out to Engels on November 14th for a, quote, little something, end quote, to buy coal and food. Engels answered with a 5-pound note and 24 bottles of wine, quote, about a dozen Bordeaux, and 2 bottles of 1846 Rhine wine for little Jenny, and the rest filled with 1857 Rhine wine, end quote. November 15th, 1862. Towards the end of the year, Jenny Marx took a short trip to Paris to confer with Aimé Massol and Élie Reclus about a French translation of Marx's, quote, economics. After its appearance in Germany, she reported that party spirit and cooperation still characterized the Paris socialists. Quote, even fellows like Carnot and Gaudichaud declare that Blanqui must be their leader when the next movement comes, end quote. Marx later wrote to Engels, January 2nd, 1863. A letter Marx wrote to Dr. Kugelmann on December 28, 1862, sheds considerable light on the progress of the, quote, economics at this point. The manuscript, Marx announced, was ready to be recopied and prepared for the printer. He summarized its contents as the, quote, quintessence, end quote, of his theories on, quote, what the English call, quote, the principles of political economy, end quote, with the exception of competition and credit. Once these basic principles have been worked out, the rest could easily be developed by others. Marx thought, quote, except perhaps for the relation of the various forms of the state to the different economic structures of society, end quote. While Marx doubted that the book would gain much recognition in Germany before being, quote, certified, end quote, abroad, it would certainly be more readily understandable than the first part, Sur Critique, because it treated, quote, concrete circumstances, end quote. However, he noted cautiously, quote, scientific attempts to revolutionize a science can never be really popular, Yet once the scientific basis has been laid, the popularizing is easy, end quote. Marx, 1862. One second. Let me make sure this is actually recording. Now I'm horrified that I'm not recording now. New section, 1863. Although he had elaborated 18 notebooks of material for his, quote, economics, end quote, during the past year and a half, Marx still put off writing the final draft of the manuscript he wished to publish as the book on, quote, capital. Instead, he continued his investigations on the theory of surplus value, adding in particular considerable information on the production of relative surplus value. In all, he filled 5 new notebooks with explanations of relative and absolute surplus value, notebooks 19 to 20, and on the transformation of surplus value into capital, primitive accumulation, the colonial system, and the reproduction process of capital, notebooks 21 to 23. While working on relative surplus value, Marx returned to study his old excerpt notebook on technology and technological history. In January, he attended a practical course, especially designed for working men, on technology and the operation of machinery, which was given by Professor Willis of the Geological Institute in London. This was necessary because, as he explained to Engels, quote, I find the simplest technical reality, where visual ability is necessary, more difficult than the largest knots, end quote. January 28, 1863. He was interested in the differences between machines and tools, a problem which becomes important when it is a question of, quote, proving the relation between human production relations and the development of these methods of material production, end quote. When a mechanism is used to produce something which had originally required human labor, Marx termed this, quote, industrial revolution, end quote. Tools, by contrast, might be developed and perfected as instruments, but never require that the raw material be worked by human hands. His studies revealed that, quote, the 2 material bases which provided the foundation in manufacturing for the development that led to the machine industry are the clock and the mill. First the corn, then the water mill, both products of antiquity, end quote. Early in the year, Marx sketched out a plan for the chapters he intended to incorporate into the first and third, quote, sections, Abschnitte, of his book on, quote, capital. The first of 6 prefigured in the 1858-59 plan of the, quote, economics. He was still thinking of including the theories on surplus value at the end of the third section. Material was foreseen for section 1 on, quote, productive and unproductive labor, end quote, from both theoretical and historical standpoints, which was later omitted in the final draft of Capital. Section 1 is in this plan corresponds to Book 1, Volume 1 of Capital, Section 3 to Book 3, Theorien über den Mehrwert, Theories of Surplus Value. Financially, for the Marx family, the year began at new depths of privation and misery. There was no money for food or coal. Marx was unable to pay the school bills for his 3 daughters, who in any case were obliged to stay at home since their winter shoes were at the pawnbrokers. Although he expected that their, quote, sham of bourgeois respectability would soon be at an end, Marx kept up a front at home to ward off outbursts of despair from the others and played the, quote, silent stoic. He was hardly able to work. For his time, his intellect, his feelings were being steadily consumed by his, quote, roasting on a low fire, end quote. So great was his own misery, both mental and physical, that he was incapable of finding more than a few perfunctory words of condolence and sympathy for Engels, who announced on January 6 the sudden death of Mary Burns, his loyal companion and friend. Engels took momentary offense at this letter, so filled with Marx's own worries and complaints, chiefly financial, and replied that he regretted being unable to help them until February 1863. Marx later wrote excusing himself for this unfortunate letter and explaining his seeming callousness as resulting from, quote, very desperate circumstances, end quote. Little Jenny was ill in bed, there was not enough food or coal in the house, his wife was reproaching him for presumably hiding the truth about their predicament from Engels. Without his knowledge, Jenny had written to Wilhelm Wolff in Manchester for £1 to buy, quote, immediate necessities, end quote, and Wolff had sent her £2. Engels, of course, forgot his anger and disappointment, quote, happy not to have lost at the same time as Mary, my oldest and best friend, end quote. January 26, 1863. Should his creditors continue to press for payment, Marx was now decided to declare himself bankrupt and find positions for the 2 older girls as governesses and move into the, quote, city model lodging house, end quote, with his wife and the youngest. To prevent him from taking this irrevocable step, Engels arranged for a 100-pound bill of exchange, and not without considerable risk to his own financial situation, since the American crisis had reduced his earnings from 300 pounds to 350 pounds in the past half year. Between March and July, Marx received another 250 pounds from their friend Dronke, as Engels again promised to repay the loan. Despite the rupture in their personal relations, Lassalle continued to send Marx copies of his most recent publications. This year, Marx received his Arbeiter program, Working Men's program, and a offenes Antwortschreiben, an open reply, but did not acknowledge either of them to the author. He reasoned that, quote, were I to criticize his stuff, I would only be wasting my time. He adopts every word anyway as if it were his own discovery. To rub his nose in his plagiarism would be ridiculous, since I have no desire to accept the form in which he has muddled our things. It wouldn't do either to recognize his boast and his bad taste, end quote. June 12, 1863. The Arbeiter program was the text of a speech which Lassalle had held in his own defense before the Berlin Criminal Court. In Marx's words, quote, nothing other than a bad vulgarization of the, quote, manifesto and other things we have preached so often that they have become, in certain sense, banalities, end quote. Marx to Engels, January 28, 1863. Lassalle, the impertinence, Marx wrote, to term his work, quote, more than scientific, in many respects a scientific art, end quote. Quote, a condensed philosophy of history, a development of the, quote, inner soul, end quote, of European history, end quote. Quote, the fellow obviously thinks he is going to take over our stock and trade, end quote, Marx remarked in conclusion. A Polish insurrection broke out on January 15, 1863. Marx, upon hearing this news, optimistically announced that an, quote, era of revolution, end quote, had been reopened in Europe under more favorable auspices than in 1848. Although the movement seemed to lack new leaders and what was so essential, the enthusiasm of the masses, Marx thought that its champions and supporters were more wisely prepared for the exigencies of a revolutionary situation. Quote, we know now the role stupidity plays in revolutions and how they are exploited by scoundrels, end quote. Letter to Engels, February 13th, 1863. Marx suggested that together he and Engels should compose a manifesto on the Polish question and have it published in the name of the German Working Men's Educational Association in London. It was decided that Engels would begin the project with a section on the military aspect of the question, and that Marx would complete it with diplomatic aspect. Engels seems to have been discouraged by the subsequent turn of events in Poland, for he evidently did not write the material agreed upon. Marx attempted several times to put his thoughts on paper, but repeated illness kept him from finishing. Between the end of February and May, he accumulated 70 notebook pages of excerpt material on the Polish question and himself wrote about 42 pages of the text, which he entitled, quote, Poland, Prussia, and Russia, end quote. The main objective of this writing was an attack on the Prussian state, and particularly its, quote, tiresome House of Hohenzollern, end quote, whose life principle was the Russo-Prussian alliance. In the Prussian state, Marx saw, quote, Russia's jackal on the European stage, end quote, whose very existence was, quote, the outcome of Poland's ruin and the Hohenzollerns' betrayal of Poland, end quote. More explicitly, quote, if Prussia figured in the first division of Poland as Russia's chief diplomatic agent, it became, at the second division, the Russian agent provocateur, and advanced with the third division to Russian executioner, end quote. The existence of the Prussian state and its capacity for expansion depended therefore on Poland's division and its subjection to Russian domination. The strength and unity of Germany as a nation would never be achieved until the Hohenzollern state had been destroyed. Poland reconstituted and Russian influence over Germany banished for good. In a letter to Engels, Marx remarked that, quote, the Polish question is merely a new opportunity to prove that it is impossible for German interests to prevail as long as the state in ordinary of the House of Hohenzollern continues to exist, end quote. March 24th, 1863. In May, Marx announced to Engels that he had abandoned the writing project on Poland, explaining that, quote, it would have only cut off my chance of traveling to Prussia without directly serving any purpose, end quote. May 29th, 1863. Marx received a letter from Dr. Kugelmann in March, encouraging him to continue his work begun in Sur Critique, which, although out of date, provided a, quote, theoretical appeasement for a few fine souls, end quote. He commented ironically to Engels, quote, the question which never occurs to these gentlemen for an instant is what I am supposed to live on in the meanwhile when doing this, quote, out of date, end quote, work, end quote. March 24th, 1863, quote, that men of genius also have to drink, eat, and be lodged, and even have to pay for these things is for the Philistine Germans too prosaic a thought that they could ever think it, end quote. Engels replied. Now that his health permitted, Marx did considerable reading during this period. As he reported to Engels, quote, what I did was in part to fill up gaps, diplomatic and historic in the Russo-Prussian-Polish matter, and in part to read and make excerpts from all kinds of works on the history of that part of political economy which I have been working on, end quote. May 29th. In April he again reread Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England, this time with a feeling of melancholy as he perceived the difference in style between the youthful passion and boldness of the young Engels and the, quote, grey and grey, end quote, of his own age and dismal future. Quote, the whole thing gains a certain warmth and spirited humor through the very illusion that tomorrow or the day after the results will also spring into the light of historical day, end quote. To Engels, April 9th, 1863. It was not until early June that Marx actually returned to his writing, thinking that if he were able to work without interruptions, the manuscript would be quickly finished. He went once again to the British Museum Library and continued with his notes on the theory of surplus value. Presumably in connection with the investigations of the production process, he also began studying differential and integral calculus. He was working 10 hours a day on the, quote, economics. On the basis of the tableau économique compiled by Dr. Quinet, Marx worked out an economic table in three categories: consumer goods, machinery, and raw materials, the total reproduction process. By August, he could report that the text being prepared for the printers was gradually assuming, quote, a passable popular form, except for a few unavoidable C, commodity, M, money, and MC primes. Money, commodity, and MCs. Commodity, money, and money commodities. Letter to Engels, August 15th. Sorry, that was hard to read out loud. August 15th, 1863. Jenny Marx also wrote to a friend about the enormous progress her husband was making on his book and said that, had he kept with his original plan to write 20 to 30 printer sheets, he would have been finished already. Quote, but since the Germans only believe in, quote, bulky, end quote, books, and since for those honorable people it is worthless to reduce it to greater conciseness and cut out all the superfluous material, Karl has now added much historical information. It is going to fall like a bomb, a thick volume of 50 printer sheets, onto German territory. That's a letter to Bertha Markheim, July 6, 1863. Archive for Sozialgeschichte 2, 1962. Obviously that wasn't written in 1962. It's from 1863. In October, the German Working Men's Educational Association published a brief address on the Polish question which Marx had written, urging the members to support the Polish insurrectionists. Marx inveighed against Prussia's subserviency to Russia and underlined the fact that German unity and Polish independence went hand in hand. To realize them would mean the end of Russian influence in Europe. In the light of the American anti-slavery movement, Marx called upon the German working class to protest loudly and vehemently against Germany's betrayal of the Polish cause, just as the English workers had thwarted the attempts of their ruling class to interfere in the American war. Under conditions which meant privation for the workers themselves, they had continued their opposition to American intervention, winning, quote, immortal historical honor, end quote. It was now the task of the German working class, quote, to write on its banner in flaming characters Poland's reestablishment, end quote. This address was signed by 11 members of the association, Icarius and Lessner among them. On December 2nd, 1863, Marx received a telegram from Trier with news of his mother's death. Penniless, suffering from skin ulcers, and himself, quote, already with one foot in the grave, end quote, Marx had to ask Engels for money to make the trip to the Rhineland. After leaving London on December 7th, he spent about 10 days in Trier trying to settle the matters of inheritance, but left before the formalities had been completed there. He decided to visit his uncle Phillips in Saltbammel, executor of his mother's will and custodian of a substantial part of their fortune. From Trier, Marx had written to Jenny about the daily pilgrimages he made to the old Westphalian home in the Römerstrasse, a site which reminded him of the, quote, happiest times of my youth, because it sheltered my greatest treasure, end quote. December 15th, 1863. Oh, what a sweet thing to say. Marx's return to London was delayed by a recurrence of his skin ailment, furuncles, and carbuncles, which obliged him to remain under medical care at his uncle's home. Dr. Anne Roy, Anrooy, the husband of his cousin Henriette Phillips, took charge of the patient, while his uncle, quote, a great old boy, applies my plasters and poultices himself, and my charming witty cousin with the dangerous black eyes looks after me with the greatest of care, end quote. Letter to Engels, December 27th, 1863. Although anxious to return home, Marx ceded to the doctor's authority and did not leave Holland until pronounced fit to travel in February. The end of the chapter. Thank you.